Hey, welcome to Knowledge to Nourish Whole Grains 101. My name is Kat and I'm a dietitian with Legacy Health.
Hi, Kat. Nice to see you again. I am also a dietitian that works at Legacy, and Kat and I have been working together to put some information in presentation form, and I hope you guys find this whole grains presentation useful.
Well, Emily, what do you feel comes up most when you're trying to help people eat more whole grains?
I know it's hard because I think most people know that phrase and they know that whole grains are good for you, right? So, what I often find people are a little lacking in or just craving a little more knowledge in is how to incorporate whole grains into their day in a more consistent way.
All right, well, let's talk about it and let's talk about what whole grains really are and why we want to eat more of them. And I'd also like to say, I know many people are interested in low carb diets right now. Today, we're going to really focus on the benefits of eating whole grains, which are one of our healthiest versions of carbohydrates. So here we have just a basic anatomy of a whole grain, a grain that's been untouched. And you can see there's three basic parts to this. And the parts matter because that's where the nutrients are for whole grains. So you see the bran is the outermost layer. It's an edible outer skin of the whole grain, and it contains a lot of important nutrients like B vitamins, plant nutrients like antioxidants, as well as fiber. And then you see the endosperm, which is the starchy food supply for the plant. It also contains some protein and minerals. The tiniest part packs the biggest punch. It's the embryo of the plant. So it contains all the nutrients that embryo would need to grow up and thrive and be a strong plant. And when we eat this whole grain, we get the benefits of all of those.
Yeah, so this slide shows sort of what happens when we refine or process a grain. So you can see on the left there that pretty whole grain that Kat just described. And then you see on the right where it says white grain. And again, I think a lot of people tend to know, oh, I should avoid, white bread, white pasta. And this slide is kind of showing you the reason why. When you process a grain, you have stripped away that bran and you've taken away the germ, and all that's left is that middle starchy layer, the endosperm.
Yeah, and you can see in the chart on the right the impact this has on the protein, the fiber, and then also the micronutrients, the vitamins and minerals that are contained. We see a big drop in all of those things when the grain is processed.
Yeah, I get asked a lot like, well, why? Why have we refined grains? Why has this come about? And so, the main reason is that those whole grains, they're not as shelf stable. So that was one of the reasons why we started processing grains. Another reason is that whole grains are going to take longer to cook because you have to break down that kind of hard outer shell, the bran. Um, Another reason why we've been refining grains is, preference and texture. That middle white starchy endosperm is really light and flaky, and whole grains just have a heartier texture that, some people just aren't used to. All right, so on this slide, we're going to take this concept of whole grains and expand on it a little bit to include this word intact. So, intact whole grains. And the way that I like to think about intact whole grains is that, they're as close to Mother Nature intended as possible. So, you want to picture the grain as it was originally. So kind of like that picture that we have on the slide here, you can really see, I'm guessing, but I think that that is barley and maybe like a black rice or like a wild rice. So these grains have been untouched. Um, Keeping grains in their intact form has some health benefits. And we can kind of see at the top here what we already mentioned is that they're going to retain their nutrients and their fiber and their protein. Um, Other things that you might not know is that by retaining that original structure of the grain, we're going to allow these really healthy nutrients and the rich, starchy endosperm to reach the healthy bacteria in our gut, or to reach the gut bacteria, excuse me. And the gut bacteria can eat and thrive on those nutrients. So it leads to a healthy gut microbiome. Keeping the grain in its intact form is also going to be a little bit more challenging for our stomach to break down. It's just going to take us a little bit longer. So, oftentimes, keeping them in their form like this, you feel much fuller and you feel satisfied for longer. Along the same lines, when you are um, taking longer to digest, you're going to release the carbohydrates or raise your blood sugar at a slower, more steady rate. So you're going to have, a lower insulin response to whole grains. Especially today with food prices, whole grains in their intact form are going to be less expensive because let's be honest, you're going to be doing most of the work. You have to take these home and cook them. But also by doing that, by doing more of the work yourself, you're also going to be more in control of what is added in to these grains. So you're in control of the fats, the sugars, the salt.
Right. And, most people I find have heard about eating whole grains, but they really think about eating whole grains and eating those like more processed versions like breads, whole grain crackers, things like that. And so intact whole grains are a subject that I'd love to bring up and talk with people about and make it accessible, which I think in your cooking videos, we're going to see how accessible these intact whole grains can be in the kitchen.
All right. So I think whole grains are found in a variety of forms and a variety of products at the store. If you walk even down the cracker aisle, you're going to see whole grain crackers. And so I think this slide is really nice because it breaks it down and shows us those grains at the top, which have the most health benefits. Okay, they're intact. And then further down, maybe they have less health benefits.
Okay. And as we kind of work down the hierarchy, the amount of processing increases. And then as the grain is cut and processed, that actually increases the surface area and that makes the rate of absorption in our body a lot faster, which leads to a faster blood sugar response. How quickly our body has a blood sugar response is also known as like a glycemic index. And when we consume a lot of foods that um, are more processed, we tend to have more ups and downs with our blood sugar and very little feelings of satiety or sense of fullness. So when people are wanting to better manage their blood sugar, maybe they have prediabetes, diabetes, or maybe they just notice those ups and downs because their energy or their mood is affected. I would highly recommend choosing mostly from the green categories on this chart. So there's three different shades of green at the top there, and those are going to be our best choices for blood sugar management.
You're right, Kat. And, I like to sometimes use the analogy like we rarely ever just eat a bowl of flour. You know what I mean? So, one thing to also keep in mind is that as you excuse me, further and further down this hierarchy, again, more chance that you're going to be adding in other components. We don't eat a bowl of flour, but what do we do with flour, even if it's whole wheat flour? We might make pancakes out of that. So the higher the chance that we're going to be adding in fats and added sugars and added salts. So it's important to note that, what we're adding to whole grains can also impact health.
Absolutely. And I think that's really where a lot of the bad reputation that carbohydrates have comes from, right? Because of the way that we process them and how processing leads to the need for additional fats and sugars. So, just looking at this slide, it's a summary from a large study that was published in the British Medical Journal, and it concluded that eating 5 to 6 servings of whole grains a day, which is about 90 grams of whole grains, dramatically decreases the risk of death from all causes, including some of the most prevalent chronic diseases. The study also found that eating whole grains can reduce your risk for developing the chronic diseases such as heart disease.
Yeah, and I think what's important here is that although, eating 5 to 6 servings of whole grains a day gave us the most benefit, if you're starting currently at no whole grains, you definitely are going to be improving your health just by adding in a serving or two. So, I like to be a little realistic, and this is definitely something that people should strive for. But if you're starting out small, even just incorporating a couple servings of whole grains a day or 5 to 6 servings of whole grains in a week is still going to have health benefits.
I think nutrition is always a work in progress for every person, and there's always the next level that we can jump to. And so we want to choose the next level that really fits where we're at today. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Um, the current dietary recommendations for whole grains are to eat at least half of your grains from whole grains. So that would be 3 to 5 servings of whole grains a day. This is a great place to start, and this can really help you reach the recommended fiber intake, which for women and kiddos is 25 grams a day, and for men is 38 grams a day.
Yeah, so Kat, what are some like tips that you typically give people if they're wanting to increase their whole grains? Like how do you do that?
Well, so I really like to pull from my own life, because I never want to ask someone to do something that I haven't successfully pulled off in my own life. So these are a few examples for with some meals that I make that have whole grains, and think about where you're at. Like you said, if you're currently not eating any whole grains, but you like, pasta regularly for a family dinner night, maybe a simple substitution to whole grain pasta is where you're at. So, like on the far right, that's a simple substitution. Um, in the middle, I have overnight oats, which uses a minimally processed grain of rolled oats. And this is a great option for people that need a breakfast on the go. Also for people that like things like cold cereal or granola. So this is an excellent way to reduce sugar, bump up your whole grain intake. And then on the far left is an example of an easy salad or bowl that you could throw together with an intact whole grain. That is a bowl that I made with some quinoa, black beans, tomato, red cabbage, and kale.
Yeah, and to support this, I'm also doing some cooking demonstrations, and those will also be available on the Legacy YouTube site. And just to give you sort of a little teaser of what you can find on there, I'm going to be demonstrating how you can make some Greek stuffed peppers using millet. And using another whole grain called amaranth to make some fritters. And then I have a third demonstration, which is a lot like Kat's salad here, but it's using a whole grain and making a salad for every season. So look for those on the Legacy YouTube site.
That makes me hungry. Those all sound so yummy. Um, But what about when folks are going to the store and they're starting to pay more attention about whole grains and looking for the whole grains? I know there's a lot of confusing terms out there that, like, for example, this first one, what would you say about white whole wheat flour? That's so confusing. Is it a whole grain or is it a white flour?
Yeah, this one I think is especially hard because, like I said in the very beginning, people have been trained to avoid all things white. So if you happen to see white whole wheat, typically you would see this on a bread, it is an actual whole grain. It's just a lighter version of the wheat plant. So it's a lighter colored plant. It has the same nutritional value as whole wheat. It does also have a little bit more of a mild taste. So sometimes this is a good place to start, especially if um, you have someone in your family that is a little resistant to, heartier brown whole grain breads. Another confusing term is this term enriched. And as you can see on this picture, we see this a lot with pasta products. What enriched means is that it is a processed grain, processed whole grain, but some of those nutrients that have been removed by removing the bran and the germ have been added back in. Now, the problem is that they're not always added back in the same amount that was lost. So yes, some of those nutrients have been added back in, but it's not going to be of the same quality or quantity that was in the original whole grain. Fortified is kind of along the same lines, except what fortified means is that nutrients have been added in that might not have even been in the product originally. So you might add in some iron or thiamine or folate in a quantity, or they might not have even been in the original grain. Now, pearled is sort of an interesting one. You typically only see the word pearled when you're shopping for barley, pearled barley. Um, and this, is a processed grain, but it's minimally processed because what it means is that bran, that dark outer layer, has just been polished or buffed off. So actually, some of it might remain, um, but most of it has been removed. So it's still processed, but it's a little bit more minimally processed. And the reason that they typically do this is to make the grain cook a little bit faster for our convenience.
I think the question that I hear a lot is is enriched and fortified. Are they healthy? And I think this can be really confusing because we are adding back in nutrients or adding nutrients on top of what existed in the food. And so that can actually change what the nutrition information looks like to make it look like it's loaded with nutrients. Um, but the problem I think is that most foods that are enriched and fortified are just heavily processed foods. And that to me is a bigger concern than whether enrichment and fortification is a good or a bad thing. There's some more terms when we're thinking about whole grains and looking more at the intact or minimally processed whole grains, hulled or dehulled whole grains. You also sometimes see this term applied to nuts. Strangely, hulled and dehulled means the same thing, and it's just when the tough outer shell has been removed, and usually that's necessary to make it edible and cookable. Sprouted whole grains are really interesting. So keep in mind that grains are actually seeds. And so sprouted grains have been allowed to sprout. They've been exposed to a certain amount of moisture and warmth that they've created a little sprout. And that can, in some ways, increase our absorption of certain nutrients. And for a lot of people, it improves digestion because sprouting the grain breaks down some of the parts of the grain that can be tougher to digest. An ancient grain is a grain that is considered to have been minimally changed or unchanged over time. So, for example, farro and kamut are both ancient forms of wheat, whereas the wheat that we use more commonly in our standard American diet has been bred and changed over time. Lastly, gluten-free. So the big thing I like to say about gluten-free is keep in mind it does not actually mean healthier, okay? For some people, gluten-free is necessary or is helpful for their digestion. But gluten-free is just referring to the protein gluten that is contained in wheat. And there are many whole grains that are actually naturally gluten-free. And those would be the better choices than our processed gluten-free foods like breads and pastas, crackers, tortillas, all of that. So here's some more resources that you can check out. We love the Whole Grains Council and Old Ways. Both have great information about nutrition in whole grains as well as recipes. And the American Diabetes Association also talks about the benefits of eating whole grains if you have diabetes or prediabetes. And don't miss Emily's wonderful cooking demonstrations to really show you how to bring these whole grains to your kitchen table.
Thank you, everyone, for watching.
Thank you. Be well.